name's John Barr, and I'm a professor of history here at Lone Star College, and we're very pleased to have you here. We've attempted to have a common read on campus for several years, and the common read that we chose this year is, as you may well know, 1984 by George Orwell. How many of y'all are reading this currently? Oh, okay, great. What is a little bit less well known about that book and about Orwell, I think, generally speaking, is that he was very concerned he was also a newspaper reporter, and Orwell was very concerned in his essays about this idea of truth and public truth, and what he called that the lies of history would just become accepted by people. And so oftentimes when people read 1984, they focus on some of the technologies that are in there, but also buried or in that novel is this concept of how history can be altered by people who have motives to do so. And they said, as they said in Stalin's Russia, the future is predictable, but it's the past that's uncertain. And that is kind of one of the things that Orwell was talking about. So we want to say thank you for coming out today. We have a philosophy professor here, Dr. Daniel Coleman, to talk about this concept of Orwell and truth. And this is actually a book that is out of some of Orwell's more well-known essays on this particular topic, and one I would highly recommend to you as a supplement to 1984. You can find this really at any bookstore that's around. Our next speaker that we'll have on campus around this time will be in about a week and a half at 12:30 on Wednesday, October 31st. We have Rice University professor John Bowles to talk about his book, Thomas Jefferson, the Architect of American Liberty. And if you came to the talk by Dana Berry on Wednesday night about the commodifying of slave bodies in the American South, the Bowles talk will be right along with that, but also maybe offering us a little bit of a different perspective well, not a different perspective, but another way to look at Jefferson. So at any rate, without any further ado, I'd like to say thank you for coming, and here is Dr. Daniel Coleman.
Thanks for coming. This morning, I woke up thinking about George Orwell and actually how much I like him. And, 1984 might give you the wrong sort of impression about who Orwell really is. It's really his essays that show him in a deeper sense. 1984 is a very serious book, so is Animal Farm, but in his essays, he really shows himself to be a person with a sense of humor and a person who's self-critical. And those books, when you think about them in certain ways, it shows that he's self-critical. And I'll explain that in just a minute. And he's really a person of a certain kind of humility that shows in those essays. And when you read some of the more famous essays, you see how he took experiences from history and he applied them to these two books. And in them, he really has a devotion to democracy. I think that's what really shows through. Because both of them are kind of like anti-examples of what goes wrong when democracy fails, and is replaced by totalitarianism. One of the most famous quotes, and of course this is Winston Smith in Orwell's 1984, it says, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Well, 2 + 2 = 4 is what we might call an objective truth. And of course what Orwell's talking about here is the freedom to say this objective truth. It's not just the fact of objective truth, it's the freedom to say it. What is objective truth? Objective truth is the truth that we know by means of our senses. About what we can see, what we can taste, what we can feel, what we hear. That's how we know truth. And this isn't the ultimate answer to truth, because I think there are many truths we ought to believe in that we can't completely verify about what we can see, taste, touch, and feel. But those senses are the tools for discerning the truth. Objective truth is out there. Like in a sentence, you have a subject and then you have the object. It's like the subject is in here and the object is out there. And we know the object out there by means of our sense experience, our sense data. Remember back to Copernicus and Galileo. Copernicus, unfortunately, didn't have a telescope, but I assume he had 20/20 vision. And he looked up at the sky and said, Aristotle's wrong. And the church is wrong. The Pope is wrong. The earth can't be the center of the universe. It must be that the sun is the center, and the earth circles the sun. Now, he only had his eyes. But Galileo comes along later, and he not only had his eyes, someone else had invented the telescope, and Galileo had improved it. So Galileo could add a whole range of empirical observation, the observation of his senses, to add to what Copernicus had said. And it turns out, of course it was quite controversial, for some time. People argued back and forth. But Galileo, with the sense data that the telescope had given him, he didn't have quite enough to prove that the sun was the center of the solar system, but he got the ball rolling. It's really not until much later that we have enough data to really prove it. But it took a long time. That was a controversial theory. But in the end, what wins out is objective truth. The truth is based upon our sense data that we see out there and is open to all. Other people can see it and criticize our conclusions drawn from it. That's why we have peer-reviewed journals, so your peers can look at your conclusions and critique them. Now, by contrast, is subjective truth. And probably the most famous advocate of this is Friedrich Nietzsche. I don't know if you've heard of him, famous German philosopher. And Nietzsche's view, and if you want to read more about it, it's in his Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche claims that actually we all lie, and all interpretations are lies. And what happens is our interpretations fight with one another. And the interpretation that wins is the truth, according to Nietzsche. And this becomes the authoritative interpretation. Now, that's not truth judged by our objective sense data. That's truth as a function of power. So subjective truth versus objective truth are completely different approaches. Now, in terms of objective truth, we're going to have lots of interpretations of our sense data. But how we judge between those interpretations is which one most accurately makes sense out of that sense data. We have a long history of scientific research and multiple theories of why this particular thing happens. But in the end, it's that sense data that wins out. That's objective truth. But in subjective truth, if truth is within us, if I have a truth and you have a truth, in the end, the truth that wins out is a function of power. So Orwell is completely opposed to this. Orwell is in favor of objective truth. And in fact, he feared, one of his essays says, my fear is that objective truth is vanishing from the world. And he says this because, totalitarian powers are using their version of the truth to squash all interpretations. And, there's good reason why Nietzsche was the favorite philosopher of the Nazis. His views about truth, support them squashing objective truth because objective truth was not in their favor. Now, totalitarianism. What totalitarianism means is that the state has total authority. What Orwell saw as a young man is different forms of this total authority. He was born in India, and of course he was born under the British imperialism and their rule over India. So he saw imperialism, British imperialism, as one form of totalitarianism or near totalitarianism. He eventually became a police officer in Burma, and his essay, Shooting an Elephant, shows you, he had a sense of humor about his role as a policeman for the empire, and a sense of humor about the empire itself. Well, he lampoons the empire and imperialism, and eventually he becomes a writer. He'd always wanted to be a writer, and he took that sense of humor with him. The sense of humor you don't see in 1984 in Animal Farm is there in his essays. And he writes about a whole range of things, and his fear that objective truth is vanishing is because of the rise of totalitarianism. Now, it wasn't just totalitarianism of the right, the Nazis, Mussolini, Franco in Spain. It was also totalitarianism of the left, especially the Russian Revolution. Now, in his essay, Why I Write, which I highly recommend to you, and perhaps I went too far, but I got this for $16 used. So these are, of course, more essays that I'm going to read in my lifetime. But it has all of Orwell's major essays. And Why I Write, is, you can just Google it and find it on the internet. And Why I Write, he says, the reason I write is to make the world different. Because there's an important truth that I want to say about the world. And he says, from the time I've begun to seriously write, I have written against totalitarianism. And he says, I have written for democratic socialism as I see it. And as he saw it, it was heavy on the democratic, because his enemy is totalitarianism. And it's not just totalitarianism of the right. And of course, he saw that, in his life. He fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And of course, he lived through World War II, and he saw Mussolini and Hitler and the damage to truth that those regimes did. But his concern really, as a democratic socialist, was totalitarianism from the left. Because Animal Farm, written before 1984, was a critique of the Russian Revolution. And you can see it as a partial allegory. Napoleon the pig is Stalin. The old pig who dies, is Marx. Snowball the pig is Trotsky. So there's a kind of allegory there in Animal Farm. And so I think that Orwell thought that there had been enough written about totalitarian forms of government on the right. And he decided to write about the dangers of totalitarianism from the left. Despite being a democratic socialist, he saw that as an equal danger. And of course, 1984, English socialism, Ingsoc in Newspeak, is him writing about the dangers from the left wing that could happen when a state takes on total authority over its citizens and no longer allows them to say that 2 + 2 = 4. Now, I wanted to mention, we all use this language, left wing, right wing. Where does this come from? It actually comes from prior to the French Revolution, when the French would have a kind of national council, and the king would sit at the front. And on his right hand would sit the aristocrats, which of course backed up the king. And on the left hand, would be the commoners, which of course had a bit more critique for that. And now, of course, we've gone years and miles from just before the French Revolution. And now, the right wing tends to mean those who are more conservative, who think we have basically the right idea, we just need to tweak it. And the left wing are people who are more radical, want to change society from the root. But it has to do with, the seating for that French National Council that was held, just prior to the years of the Revolution. And European parliaments have taken it up, for their seating in their houses of parliament. And of course, we use it as political language now. Orwell was concerned about all forms of totalitarianism, but he figured it would be preaching to the choir if he wrote about the dangers of right-wing totalitarianism. So he writes about the dangers of the left. Totalitarianism, however, it's not an either-or thing. It's really a kind of continuum. How much authority does the state have over citizens? How much rights do citizens themselves have? And Orwell feared the erosion of those rights. Talking about his fear that objective truth was vanishing from the world. Well, objective truth, is a way of critiquing. It's a way of critiquing other people's statements. It's a way of critiquing ours. And without truth, things begin to crumble. In the Ten Commandments, it says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. That's really a kind of legal setting. In the Buddhist 5 principles, no lying. That's a bit broader. But there's a saying, in the Talmud that I like very much, and it says that the world has 3 columns that it stands on. And these columns are peace, truth, and justice. Now, if I'd written that statement, I would have put truth first. Because it seems like, for the world to stand, it fundamentally needs truth. And that's what Orwell was concerned about. And everything he writes in 1984, really comes out of many of his personal experiences, like doublethink. Thinking 2 things that are contradictory at one time. Think about Germans prior to World War II. In the beginning, communists were the enemy. They were bad. Then came the non-aggression pact that Hitler made with Russia. Then communists are okay, they're our allies, And then, of course, Hitler invades Russia. They're bad again, So you have to have all these thoughts back and forth and be ready to change. Remember in 1984, first Eurasia is the enemy. Now they're the ally against East Asia. And it goes back and forth. So people are forced not to remember the past, to think only of the present, to think multiple things at once. The past is altered, and then people are made to think whatever they're required to think, at that moment. He saw these things happening, around him, and of course it's not just Nazi Germany, but it's Britain too. The empire is good. No, imperialism is bad. It goes back and forth. We do different things, and it's not just Germany and Britain. It's us as well. These switches, these changes, and the way we write our history books as well. The way we think or interpret, American history is this way too. And what Orwell was concerned about is, we use objective truth, to determine these things, not our subjective truths we think about ourselves, not our mythology to determine the truth. From time to time, all human beings lie. There's a wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis, I never knew what a liar I was until I decided to tell the truth all the time. So just as human beings lie, sometimes, governments do too. But the problem occurs when lying becomes a policy, both for human beings and for governments. And when it does, well, credibility itself is under threat. This occurs, of course, in 1984 with Ingsoc. It occurred in Nazi Germany. It's occurred in many different totalitarian regimes over and over in time. And totalitarianism, just kind of creeps up by a degree. It doesn't happen all at once, or at least most of the time it doesn't. The only possible cure for lies is truth, and that's objective truth. But I think truth alone is not enough. People have to care about the truth and to be willing to act on it. In a different context, I remember the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer, of course, was a theologian who was hung by the Nazis in part because of his participation in the plot to kill Hitler. And Bonhoeffer said that only those who believe act, and only those who act believe. I think only those who believe in the truth act upon it. And it's really only those who act upon it who believe. And I think that Orwell would agree with that statement. Knowing the truth is not enough, to be willing to act upon it. Even that may not be sufficient, but nevertheless, that's what's required to make the world different. To make the world better. And for him, a democratic world is better than any form of totalitarianism. Okay, well, that's all I have to say. Do you have any questions or thoughts?
I actually wanted to kind of go back to what you had said toward the beginning about how we can distinguish objective truth from subjective truth.
Yes.
And you had said primarily objective truth is acquired through sense data.
Yes.
How is it that some people acquire different truths if they experience the same sense data?
Well, there can be different interpretations of the sense data. Think about, it was Aristotle who thought the Earth was the center of the universe. And of course, he had sense data. He looked at the stars and the planets, and he arrived at this conclusion. And Copernicus had, exactly the same equipment that Aristotle had, and he arrived at a different one. So those are two radically different interpretations from the same sense data. But if we've looked at it over the centuries, we see that Copernicus more accurately interprets that sense data. It may take us a while. Like I say, it took people a long while to finally accept the fact that, the sun's the center of the solar system. It may take us a while. And even the sense data may be ambiguous. I believe that the Earth is the center of the solar system because of some authority, is not objective truth. That is a subjective truth because I accept this person or this institution as the authority. In Aristotle's case and Copernicus, they both relied upon their sense data. But Copernicus actually interpreted it better. We'd all agree now, thanks to, a mountain of sense data that we have now, that Copernicus was right and Aristotle was wrong. I think of objective truth as a tool for discernment. Objective truth is discerning the truth out there through a process of sense data. Subjective truth is actually creating the truth or inventing the truth. This is what I want the truth to be, and in the end, I attempt to force it on you. That's Nietzsche's master morality. The master is the person whose interpretation of the truth is forced upon other people, and they have to believe it. When we write things that aren't very good representations of history in history books, and we want people to believe that this is the truth of history. Well, that's subjective truth. But hopefully, as time goes on, well, people read those books and critique them and tell a different story that's more accurate. We're always telling ourselves stories about how we believe the world to be, but we ought to privilege those stories that are based upon objective truth, as best we can. Not that we're infallible, we're certainly not. Sometimes, well, like I say, objective truth is a tool for discerning the truth. And it's hard to get there. It's hard work. It takes time.
Yeah, so you said it's that interpretation of the sense data. So what if not everyone is able to access that sense data or access that experience? Is that where subjective truth becomes more prominent?
Well, I think that subjective truth becomes more prominent when there are things that we can't have sense data about, or we can't know. Are people basically good? Are they basically selfish? There's no way to add up all the numbers and get a result there. What do we think about, well, the nature of human nature? I don't think we can use objective truth to get at that. But we can use it for many other things. Like I say, objective truth is a tool. I love the crescent wrench. You buy one tool and you can use it for almost all the other wrenches. But it's not a hammer, it's not a screwdriver, it's not the ultimate tool. Objective truth won't work for things that aren't subject to our sense data. But they can tell us that one thing is true and one thing is false, by means of looking at the sense data.
I think one thing I would add to that, what your question is, and Orwell was very concerned about the power of governments to alter the realities in which we lived. Because for so much of human history, governments have been so tiny in reach, but with the growth of these new states, totalitarian governments, at their disposal, having control of media and things of that nature, they had the very power to alter reality for people. So even if they have access to the data, it doesn't matter, because part of their data is so skewed by these totalitarian governments that they can't see the world properly. Orwell once said that to see what is in front of one's nose is a constant struggle. And I think that's what he maybe meant by that. Now the other thing I would add, and I wanted to ask you about this, is I would say that we're not truth-seeking animals in a way, that we evolved in conditions for tens of thousands of years where our minds developed on an African savanna where what was important was survival and reproduction. It wasn't truth-seeking. So to see patterns in a bush, even though there's nothing there, might be advantageous, because if you're wrong and there's an animal that you're seeing in that bush and it's there and it eats you, that's a real problem, right? But if you see a pattern in a bush and the animal's not there, you're still okay. You've seen the pattern, and so it's helpful to actually not see what's true. And so that's why it's so hard, it seems to me, for us to actually accurately find out what's true. Because we're not really, we are, but in a way we weren't evolved under circumstances where we're truth-seeking animals. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's more a comment than the question.
Yes.
But at any rate.
Well, I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary Jane. It's about Jane Goodall. And it's all these films that were found from when she went to Africa to study chimpanzees, because nobody had ever lived with chimpanzees before. And I won't give away what's in the film, but there are some tragic events among the chimpanzees. Suddenly I realized, oh yes, that's as human beings. Yeah. That made me think just about chimpanzees and humans. After I'd watched Jane, I heard about this other study about bonobos. They're not chimpanzees, but they look like them to us. About bonobos and sharing food. And they thought they'd run the experiment, with both bonobos and human children. and it turned out that, bonobos eat these kinds of nuts, and they have to have rocks to crush the nuts. And they were willing to share the food with the other bonobos, but not the rocks. So it became useless. So bonobos will share food, but then they turn to the human children. And the researcher said, compared to bonobos and especially chimpanzees, human children are saints. Although human children can be mean, of course we all know that by experience. Human children will cooperate and will share food and various other things in ways that chimpanzees will not. No chimpanzee will share food, but bonobos will. But human children are just generous with the food. So we are cooperative. We have to be cooperative with one another. The fact that most of us are strangers and we're all sitting here. Talking about the same thing says something about human beings. That's not true of any other animal. And although we may have, an evil side, along with our relatives, the chimpanzees, we have a good side too, our relatives, the bonobos. And that doesn't mean we're truth-seeking, animals, but we require truth to be able to cooperate with one another. Lies really presuppose that there is a truth, and we can convince other people that our lie is the truth. So we do lie, but telling the truth allows us to cooperate with one another. So we kind of presuppose the truth, to some degree, but we wouldn't have these religious injunctions against lying if it weren't a problem, among us as human beings. But I think we presuppose the truth to a significant degree. I mean, when we talk to a person, we generally presuppose they're telling the truth, unless something kind of keys us that they might be lying. So we hope for truth, but we know that people lie, and we kind of keep our antenna up, to make sure. And other animals lie too. The blue jays in your backyard are terrible liars. They see that leftover cat food and they yell out a hawk imitation. It scares away all the other blue jays, and then they come and get the food all alone. So we're not the only lying species. There are others. But I think we fight against it. In some way, I think we're both better and more evil than other animal species. We have a potential for good that they don't have, and a potential for evil that they don't have too.
Are y'all reading 1984 right now? How far along are you?
I'm halfway.
Well, if you have a chance, dip into some of Orwell's essays. There's one called "Let's Get Together and Have a Good Hate," and it's him going to a political speech and just talking about, it's all about hate and just kind of lampooning the speech. Remember Hate Week in 1984 and 2 Minutes Hate? And it really comes out of that essay and his observation. Here are people striving for political change, which they're teaching is hate. It's another reason why I like Orwell. You don't see his humor in 1984 or Animal Farm, really. But he thought that was just all wrong. To teach people hate, in the name of, progressive politics. He just thought that was just wrong.
I was going to say, Daniel, that one of the books that really profoundly affected me that I read when I was about 20 is Homage to Catalonia. Orwell's memoir, Going to Fight in the Spanish Civil War
Yes.
against Franco, and Franco was fascistic, and there were fascists on his side, but among his essays, after the war was over, he wrote Looking Back on the Spanish War, and that's the quote about this feeling that in this world we live in, the concept of objective truth is disappearing. And
Yes.
I would recommend that to students because so much of what he saw there, not just the fascists, but the communists,
Yes.
anticipates what he does in 1984. And I wanted to say that not an example, maybe so much of lying, but of just outrageous dishonesty, that when we were assigned Animal Farm, and in the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, and we kind of know the propagandistic purpose to which that book was put for American students. The edition that's still in print today, the introduction, quotes that sentence, the famous sentence from, it's famous to us, Why Right? Every single line, series line I've written since 1936 has
Yes.
been against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it.
Yes.
In that introduction, that editor has agreed every series line has, since 1936, has been against totalitarianism, ellipses.
Yes.
So in our society in the 50s and 60s, there frankly was a lot of lying and
Yes.
dishonesty too, that there was an alternative to capitalism and communism. And I
Yes.
think I know what Orwell would have thought of that.
Yes.
It just to me, on the part of an academic, to change the meaning of a sentence like that is
Yes.
just so thoroughly
Yes.
and despicably dishonest.
And I think it
It's still
happened a
correct
lot.
right
Actually, there's a controversy in Britain about Animal Farm and it being published because the British didn't like the idea that the ruling class were pigs. You know, they thought, oh, surely they're talking about us. You know, so that was another thing. But in a similar vein, when I was a child, I would watch things on television that the rest of my family did not care for. But there used to be a kind of theater production that came on, and I remember watching Barefoot in Athens, and it was all about Socrates. And I listened, and years later, of course, I would read Plato, and it completely misconstrued Plato's political philosophy. Of course, these were the Cold War years,
now.
and it made Socrates into an advocate of democratic government, which actually he was not. So there's probably lots of that going on. But I thought it shows Orwell's largesse of spirit, in a sense. For Orwell, totalitarianism was the enemy, whether on the right or on the left. Animal Farm and 1984 are books that fight against totalitarianism on the left. Because, I think, he didn't need to write a book about totalitarianism on the right because everyone had seen it, right there in World War II. He says, there can be a world that's undemocratic on the left just as there can be one that way on the right as well. I think we need to be reminded of both constantly. But nevertheless, Orwell would critique, the people who were closer to him in his thinking. He wanted people to have the right to vote, the right to speak the truth, to say that 2 + 2 = 4. And it didn't matter which side, left or right wing you were on. He wanted people to have that freedom. And I think that was most important to him, against totalitarianism.
But what about this view by some that democracy is simply another form of totalitarianism? It's simply a dictatorship of the majority, whereas totalitarianism is a dictatorship of the minority.
Well, I think democracy can become a cover for totalitarianism. Just like, during the era of the communist government in Russia, everybody voted, but it was not democratic. Well, even in the Russia today, people vote, but it's not democratic. There's only, one person that you have to vote for. And, at times, people in democracies make wrong decisions. Not just our democracy, but other democracies too. But that does not give them total authority so long as individuals have rights that are protected. If the majority of our government says one thing, but yet I still have the same rights as everyone else, then the state doesn't have total authority. I may not agree with what the majority has decided, but if we have, well, the semblance of a vote, but that vote robs me of my, of my personal rights, say illustrated in the Bill of Rights, well, then we have a false democracy and really a totalitarian form of government. I don't know if that's a good answer, John.
They're both dictatorships.
Yes, yes.
That's real.
That's what I wanted to
Yeah.
tie into as well, because during containment, as far as the government trying to get rid of communism, whenever the Soviets were going down towards, was it Taiwan, I believe, and the U.S. government was sitting there supporting the people that were against communism, but yet you had these communist people that were for it, and because their decision was less than the majority, they got pushed away and said, no, that's not going to happen. So I guess, yeah, that would tie into where democracy becomes a totalitarian government, in a sense.
But I think it can't be totalitarian unless individuals are robbed of their rights.
But that's what they did. They took that away from those people that wanted that communist regime.
Yeah.
And I feel like that was a form of robbing them.
You're talking about Vietnam, you mean?
I think it means the Red Scare. Daniel, is that what you mean? Are you talking about the Red Scare of the 50s?
That and whenever, well, there's been different versions, also like the one from El Salvador, when you had the right wing trying to take over the government, and the U.S. government was supporting that Nicaraguan rebellion to combat them and prevent them from taking over the government in El Salvador.
Or you take the case of Congo under Lumumba, right? Where the CIA was opposed to Lumumba because they felt he was aligned to the Soviets, and they had to take him out. The people wanted that system.
Yes. And of course, well, I think our government has a long history of interfering in the governments of other countries. So from the viewpoint of people outside the United States, I think the U.S. appears more like a totalitarian government. But from within, people still have, certain rights, who are citizens. So I don't think we can think of ourselves as being totalitarian, at least not at this point.
Okay.
Let's hope not in the future. But I know what you're talking about. I think about when Salvador Allende was president of Chile, and the revolt there that was backed by the U.S. and a whole range of things that have happened.
I served in Afghanistan, and some of the things that got distributed amongst us were these unforgotten pictures of a Special Forces unit incorporating President Karzai during that time. And I'm assuming that President Karzai was chosen by the U.S. government because he was somebody that can be easy to talk to, or in other words, manipulate so that where it'll function the way that the U.S. government wanted it to function there in Afghanistan.
There's a word that's used in 1984. If I'm not mistaken, I didn't have time to go back and look at solipsism.
Yes.
And is that a philosophical term? And if so, is it something? How's it related to what you're talking about?
I don't think it's related to what I'm talking about. Solipsism means I can only be sure of myself and what's going on within me and my own thoughts. I can't be sure of anything beyond me, of other people. I think of it as Descartes. Descartes talking about
subjective. That's not what is implied. That the truth is eternal.
I'm sorry, I forget the passage in 1984. I wonder if it's referring to like Winston's All Alone. and he can't be sure what anybody else is thinking. But I'm not certain because I'm sorry, I
Someone else
don't
remember
remember.
that?
I was going to say, just to back up a little bit, the definition of solipsism is to acknowledge that only the self exists. I remember first seeing this word in Nabokov's Lolita, when Humbert is talking about how the passage escapes me for some reason, Lolita, it's been a while. But the point of the matter is with 1984 and solipsism, it's not just about the self, it's about the party. So it's not self-solipsism that's taking place in 1984. It's collective. That only the party exists and only the party's agenda exists, and everything else is stifled into non-existence.
It's toward the end where Winston's being tortured by what's the character's name? Played by Richard O'Brien. O'Brien, exactly. I'll have to go back and see, but
Yeah.
that's my recollection.
I'm sorry there isn't an index in the book,
Yeah.
you know, with the whole series of words that are used multiple times. That'd be good.
Yeah, so solipsism itself is the theory that nothing exists outside of the consciousness of the individual, in which case, on its own, yeah, that would be acknowledging that only I exist and you don't exist, therefore I don't have to care about you. But in 1984, that is expanded upon to mean collective solipsism. So only the party exists.
Well, I think we're about out of time now, but I just wanted to say, you know, I encourage you to read 1984 and Animal Farm, but be sure to sample some of his essays because, you know, you get to see Orwell in a more relaxed sort of vein, you know, where he has a sense of humor and, you know, he critiques a whole lot of things you wouldn't expect him to critique. And he writes about it really in a funny way. You know, as, well, an emissary of the British Empire shooting an elephant. And, you know, how, you know, the Burmese respond to him. And it's really funny. And it's, well, it's truthful in a way that we've never looked at it in that way. Or we're not... well, we've never had experience like Orwell's experience, but he writes in a lively fashion and funny and insightful. You don't need to buy this huge book, but you can find several of those just by Googling them on the internet. Why I Write, you know, Shooting an Elephant, and there's a whole host of others. But anyway, thank you for coming and for participating. You know, I forgot to mention one thing. Galvan loaned me this book yesterday, and already I've read to page 60. It's on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century, and the 10th lesson is believe in truth. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power, because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. The biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights. Orwell would agree with that immediately.